You are in 1927, standing at the edge of a town that seems far from everything else in the world. Aracataca is a railway town, its heartbeat tied to the banana plantations that rise around it. Workers shuffle to and from the fields, and every story in the marketplace seems to grow taller with each telling. This is the world Gabriel is born into, where truth and rumor blend so smoothly that even a child cannot tell one from the other. You follow him as a boy, moving between the wooden rooms of his grandparents' house, a place filled with whispers, memories, and shadows of the past. His father, Gabriel García, is often away, a pharmacist with a stubborn streak and a love that once caused scandal. His mother, Luisa Santiago, carries her own quiet strength. But in these early years, the boy is raised mostly by his grandparents. They become the compass of his imagination, shaping how he will later see both reality and the surreal. His grandfather, Colonel Nicolás Marquez, carries himself with pride. His stories weighted with history and regret. He tells Gabriel about battles long past, about honor and betrayal, about land disputes that scarred the region. Sometimes the boy listens wide-eyed, sensing that the old man's voice is half memory, half myth. His grandmother, Tranquilina Iguarán, balances this with tales filled with ghosts and premonitions, stories told so plainly that the supernatural seems like just another neighbor knocking at the door. You watch young Gabriel absorb all of this, and it feels like his mind is already storing a world he will one day write. Aracataca itself seems both alive and tired. You can smell the sweetness of tropical fruit mixed with the sharp scent of ink and paper whenever newspapers arrive on the train. At night, the stars spread wide above the town, and the boy hears grown-ups murmur about events that shake Colombia. Civil wars, political uprisings, the banana workers' strike that ended in blood just before his birth. Historians still argue whether hundreds or even thousands were killed in that massacre, but in the collective memory of Aracataca, the number does not matter. The grief lingers like dust in the air. You wander the same streets Gabriel does, stepping over uneven stones and hearing dogs bark in the distance. He learns early to pay attention to the little details, the smells of coffee brewing in the morning, the cracked walls that seem to lean with age, the way his grandmother insists that dreams are omens. A quirky truth that stays with him is the belief she once shared that the presence of butterflies in a room means a spirit has passed by. Later, when he writes about yellow butterflies swirling around a character named Mauricio Babylonia, you recognize the seed planted here, in his childhood home. The boy is shy, almost withdrawn, yet he notices everything. He watches as workers gossip under mango trees, as soldiers march down the road, as traveling merchants bring fabrics and strange objects from cities he cannot yet imagine. He records it all silently, with the gaze of someone who feels the world is both ordinary and enchanted. There are days when he slips away to the river, dipping his toes in the cool current, watching fish dart under the surface. On other days he stands at the train station, staring at the iron beast that carries strangers into town, leaving dust clouds behind as it disappears. In these moments you feel how wide the world must seem to a child who has never left his corner of Colombia. Aracataca has its quiet beauty, but also its shadows. Poverty sits beside wealth, and whispers of old conflicts fill the evenings. Yet through it all, the boy grows, guided by voices that we've historied with myth, teaching him that the line between what is real and what is imagined is thin, almost invisible. You feel how natural it is for him to accept that ghosts might walk among the living, or that a single event can be both tragedy and legend depending on who tells it. The family house is filled with objects that seem ordinary at first glance but take on strange meaning when viewed through his young eyes. A broken clock that no longer ticks is treated like an heirloom. A wooden chest creaks like it hides mysteries. And a picture of a long-dead relative seems to follow him when he moves through the hall. It is in these rooms, with their heavy silence and their occasional bursts of laughter, that the boy begins to learn how stories breathe. As you drift further into this place, you can almost hear the murmur of relatives talking late into the night, voices blending with the distant sound of crickets. Gabriel lies awake sometimes, listening, storing every phrase, every detail, as if he knows already that words are treasures. When morning comes, he wanders again into the streets where children chase each other barefoot and vendors call out their goods. The rhythm of Aracataca beats steadily, simple yet filled with layers of memory. You realize this childhood is no ordinary one. It is both ordinary and extraordinary, both rooted in daily life and floating in imagination. The little boy running through dusty streets is already preparing, without knowing it, to give the world a town called Macondo, a place that will feel both familiar and magical. And as you leave this first part of the journey, you can still hear the echoes of cicadas in the trees, reminding you that every beginning holds the seeds of an entire world waiting to be told. You remain in the house where shadows stretch long across the floorboards, and the air feels heavy with stories waiting to be spoken. The boy lingers close to his grandfather, Colonel Nicolás Marquez, whose presence fills the room like a monument. He sits in his rocking chair, his voice slow but firm, telling tales of the civil wars that scarred Colombia. You lean in to hearing about cavalry charges, lost comrades, and battles where the outcome was uncertain until the last breath. The colonel speaks not only of victories but of betrayals, and sometimes his eyes drift to a distance that is not measured in space but in years. You sense that he is not just teaching his grandson about the past, he is passing on a way of seeing the world where history bleeds into daily life. The boy listens, wide-eyed, though he does not yet understand everything. Still, he senses the weight of those stories, like heavy stones dropped into the well of his memory. And then, in the next room, his grandmother takes over the lesson with a very different tone. Tranquilina Iguaran tells tales as if they are everyday truths. She speaks of omens, of ghosts that appear in doorways, of relatives who predicted their own deaths. To her, the world of the supernatural is not strange, but as ordinary as boiling water for coffee. You smile softly, realizing how this blend of the Colonel's sharp history and his wife's magical visions planted the roots of something remarkable in the boy's imagination. One night you hear her whisper about a spirit that wandered through the courtyard, its steps light as moth wings. Another time, she insists that dreams carry messages. If you dream of teeth falling out, someone will soon die. If you dream of water, a journey awaits. She tells these things with such calm certainty that young Gabriel accepts them as part of reality. This is a quirky fact of his upbringing. To him, the boundaries between real and unreal are almost invisible. It is not a surprise that, later in life, he will write with the same calm tone when telling of rain that lasts for years or a girl ascending to heaven while folding sheets. You notice how different the two grandparents are. The Colonel with his rifles and medals, his stories of war and politics, and Tranquilina with her candles, herbs, and quiet whispers of the unseen. The boy sits between these two worlds, one of steel and one of spirits, absorbing both without conflict. Historians still argue whether this unusual mix of influences is what gave birth to magical realism, or whether it was the broader culture of the Caribbean coast, where African, indigenous, and Spanish traditions blended into one. Either way, the boy's mind grows like a sponge, soaking in every tale. Sometimes the Colonel takes him on slow walks through the garden. He points to plants with medicinal uses, tells stories of men he once fought beside, and warns him about the mistakes of politics. Other times his grandmother sends him on small errands that feel like rituals, buying candles for the altar, fetching herbs said to cure mysterious ailments. Both are teaching him about the world, though in very different languages. You watch as he carries these lessons silently, his eyes always observing, his heart storing them like seeds. Beyond his grandparents' house, Aracataca itself seems to conspire in shaping his imagination. On some afternoons, funeral processions pass by, and people murmur about the deceased as if they had already become myths. On other days, music drifts from the plaza, lively and full of rhythm, reminding him that joy and sorrow are often neighbors. The boy notices how everyone in town has a story to tell, and how every story seems to stretch beyond what logic might allow. It becomes normal to him that truth is elastic, shaped by the teller. The Colonel's authority is strong, but his days are fading. Sometimes he coughs deeply, and you sense the boy's worry as he sits close by. Yet even when weak, the old man continues to tell stories, determined that his grandson will carry them forward. Meanwhile, his grandmother makes the boy laugh with strange little warnings. She might say, "Don't sweep at night, or you'll chase away good luck. Don't leave scissors open, or evil spirits might slip through." These sayings stay with him, little fragments of folklore that later reappear disguised in novels. You pause for a moment and notice how memory itself is becoming a character in his life. Every hallway seems to echo with the voices of relatives gone. Every corner holds traces of a story already half forgotten. For Gabriel, memory is never just looking back, it is another layer of the present. As he grows, you see him carry notebooks, scribbling down thoughts, doodles, fragments of conversations. He begins to realize that words themselves are powerful, able to trap both the Colonel's thunderous battles and his grandmother's whispering ghosts. One of his teachers in town notices this and encourages him, saying he has a gift for language. It is only a small comment, but you sense how deeply it lodges in his heart, sparking the first flames of ambition. At night, as he lies in bed, the stories swirl together. The Colonel's tales of soldiers with mud on their boots, the grandmother's visions of spirits brushing through curtains, the gossip from neighbors who exaggerate everything for effect. It all blends into a single fabric, woven tightly, impossible to pull apart. You realize you are standing at the very beginning of what will one day become novels that astonish the world. And yet, in these moments he is just a boy, small in a vast house, listening to voices, dreaming quietly, shaping the universe within his mind. You hear the rocking chair creak, you smell the faint scent of herbs drying in the kitchen, and you feel how the walls themselves hold memory. Aracataca may be small, but inside the imagination of Gabriel García Márquez, it is already infinite. The house grows quieter as you move with Gabriel into his teenage years. When the walls that once echoed with his grandparents' stories seem too small to contain him, you sense his mind restless, reaching for something beyond the dusty streets of Aracataca. He leaves behind the warmth of that childhood world and steps into the noise and chaos of Colombia's cities. Suddenly, instead of cicadas and ghost stories, he is surrounded by newspapers, printing presses, and the chatter of journalists who live on coffee and deadlines. You sit beside him at a wobbly desk, the smell of ink and paper sharp in the air as he scratches words onto cheap sheets. He begins working as a journalist in the 1940s, at a time when Colombia itself is boiling with political tensions. The country is moving toward la violencia, that period of brutal unrest between liberals and conservatives. You watch him struggle to capture not only the facts but the deeper truth of the people caught in that storm. His sentences are sharp, his style already distinctive, even though he is still finding his voice. Every newsroom he enters feels alive in a different way. Typewriters clatter like machine guns, cigarette smoke curls to the ceiling, and editors shout over the noise. Gabriel is quiet compared to many of his peers, but his writing speaks with a clarity that earns him respect. He often slips away to observe ordinary life in cafes, bus stations, and city plazas, convinced that the heart of a nation can be found in the small details others overlook. A quirky detail from these years is how little money he carries in his pocket. There are days when he barely eats, living on coffee and bread, yet he never lets go of his desire to write. Friends tease him for wearing the same suit again and again, patched until the fabric is thin, but he doesn't seem to care. What matters to him is finding words that matter. Later, he would joke about this period of poverty, saying it taught him how much he could live without, as long as he had a story to chase. Historians still argue whether Gabriel's journalism shaped his fiction more than his childhood did. Some believe the disciplined attention to facts, the way he sought evidence and structure, gave his novels their weight. Others claim that his true genius came only from those ghostly tales of his grandmother in the dusty streets of Aracataca. Watching him in these years, you realize it was not one or the other, it was both, braided together. The precision of journalism kept his imagination grounded, while his imagination kept journalism alive with color. He covers everything from political scandals to small-town curiosities. In Barranquilla he falls in with a group of writers and thinkers known as the Barranquilla Group, who discuss literature late into the night. They pass around books from Europe and North America, feeding on Hemingway's crisp prose, Kafka's unsettling worlds, Faulkner's layered towns. Gabriel absorbs it all, comparing these faraway voices to the rhythms he knows from Colombia. You watch him realize that the stories of his own land, told with equal seriousness, can stand beside the great works of the world. There is a sense of apprenticeship here, though it is not formal. He learns by trial and error, by rushing to meet deadlines, by seeing his work printed for strangers to read. Some articles are forgotten quickly, but others spark attention. He is slowly carving out a name, though fame still feels distant, like a star glimpsed but out of reach. At night, after long days in the newsroom, he walks the streets alone. Neon lights flicker above shop doors, and music drifts from bars. He notices couples arguing in whispers, old men playing cards on sidewalks, street vendors calling into the night. These fragments find their way into his notebooks. You sense that nothing is wasted. Every gesture, every overheard phrase becomes a thread he will one day weave into a tapestry. Yet this life is not easy. The country is dangerous, the politics explosive. Journalists are often threatened, and sometimes killed, for exposing truths that powerful men want hidden. Gabriel knows this, yet he keeps writing. There is courage in it, though he rarely speaks of it. For him, the act of writing feels as natural as breathing, no matter the risk. One small but telling moment comes when he writes about a minor crime in such vivid detail that readers are gripped. Instead of simply stating the facts, he paints the scene, the smell of the alley, the tension in the suspect's voice, the way neighbors whispered as if part of a theater play. People begin to notice that he does not just report events, he transforms them into something unforgettable. Still, recognition does not come quickly. Years pass with little money, little comfort, and little certainty. He moves from one city to another, from Cartagena to Bogotá, always chasing work, always carrying his notebooks. You imagine him boarding crowded buses, coat fraying, suitcase nearly empty, but with a heart full of unwritten stories. In the quiet of those nights, he dreams of larger works, of novels that will one day hold entire worlds. But for now, he sharpens his craft, line by line, article by article, in newsrooms filled with smoke and noise. The boy who once listened to his grandmother's whispers has now become a young man recording the world's clamor. You sense the transformation, slow but certain, as the journalist's pen prepares to become the novelist's brush, and as he walks home through darkened streets, you hear the faint echo of cicadas again, a reminder that no matter how far he roams, Aracataca's dust still clings to his shoes. You watch Gabriel grow older, and the newsroom chatter begins to fade as another rhythm takes over, one of constant movement, searching, and surviving. He is no longer just a young reporter with a few pesos in his pocket. Now, he drifts between cities, jobs, and moments of near hunger. There are days when the money runs out, when rent goes unpaid, and when meals are skipped. Yet in these struggles, his voice as a writer sharpens, as if hardship is the whetstone against which he polishes his imagination. He moves often, carrying his notebooks from Barranquilla to Bogotá, from the Caribbean coast to the capital's cold streets. Each city teaches him something different. In Barranquilla there is the sea breeze, the openness of the coast, and the laughter of his writer friends, who dream of changing literature. In Bogota there is the seriousness of politics, the grayness of power, and the fear that hovers after each new outbreak of violence. You walk alongside him through these shifting worlds, sensing his unease but also his persistence. A quirky detail stands out during these years. He sometimes pawned his possessions, including even his typewriter, just to get by. Imagine a writer forced to trade away the very tool he needs most. But each time, he found a way back, borrowing a machine from a friend or scribbling in longhand. The words never stopped. He would joke years later that poverty taught him creativity, not only in storytelling but in survival itself. At the same time, he begins to travel beyond Colombia, pulled by opportunities that are more promises than guarantees. He spends time in Europe, often with barely enough money to eat. In Paris, he rents a tiny room, damp and cold, where he writes furiously even when he cannot afford heating. Sometimes he eats only bread and coffee, and other days he depends on friends' kindness. You can almost feel the hunger gnawing at him, yet his imagination remains full. Historians still argue whether these struggles broke him down or built him up. Some say the hardships nearly destroyed him, that he came close to giving up writing altogether. Others believe these were the exact years that forged his resilience, the years that taught him endurance and humility. You notice that in his later novels, poverty is described not with pity but with a sharp eye, as if he knew from within what it meant to live with empty pockets but a full mind. In Madrid, Rome, and even further across Europe, he keeps wandering, always listening, always observing. He takes jobs as a foreign correspondent, reporting on political events, and sometimes those assignments collapse, leaving him stranded with unpaid wages. Yet he turns even misfortune into fuel. Once, in Paris, after his paper suddenly cut his salary, he found himself trapped in the city with no income at all. Instead of panicking, he poured his energy into writing. It was during such periods of near despair that his early drafts of novels began to form. One evening in a smoky cafe, he sits among fellow exiles and struggling artists. The air is thick with conversations in Spanish, French, Italian, each voice carrying its own longing. He listens more than he speaks, his dark eyes taking in every gesture, every tone. Later, fragments of these nights will slip into his stories, where characters speak with the weight of wanderers who never quite belong. But alongside these challenges, there are bright sparks. He keeps sending his short stories and drafts to magazines and publishers. A few are published, though they earn little. The recognition is small, but it keeps him alive with hope. He begins to believe that all the wandering, all the hunger, will one day lead somewhere larger. At times, he returns briefly to Colombia, and each visit reminds him of the stories that still burn in his chest. He sees banana workers toiling, hears old tales retold, feels the pulse of his homeland. These returns are bittersweet. Home is familiar, yet he cannot stay long. The world is calling him outward again, and so he goes. You follow him into cramped apartments where the wallpaper peels, where the sound of footsteps echoes from the hall. You see him bent over a desk, candlelight flickering, scribbling late into the night. You see the letters from friends piling on the table, each filled with news, encouragement, or despair of their own. He is part of a generation of writers spread thin across continents, connected by their hunger for words. There is also love in these wandering years, though not yet the great steady love of his life. There are fleeting romances, friendships that blur into affection. But Gabriel himself is too restless, too uncertain to anchor. His heart seems married to the act of writing itself, even when it pays him nothing. It is during these years that he begins to experiment with blending the journalistic clarity of his reporting with the magical tones of his childhood. He writes stories where the extraordinary enters daily life without warning. A man wakes to find himself transformed. A town is haunted by rain. A woman whispers with ghosts. These stories are not yet widely known, but you sense that something is beginning to crystallize. One night, as he leans over his notebook, the sound of Paris rain tapping the window, he writes with a fury as if he cannot stop. His words spill out faster than his pen can move. You can almost see the shadow of Macondo forming in his imagination, though he does not yet know the town's name. These are years of uncertainty, yet they are also years of gathering. He collects experiences, textures, sensations, voices, and tucks them away. He may not have money, but he is rich with material. You walk with him through these narrow alleys of struggle, sensing that each hardship is only a step toward a story that will one day astonish the world. Through the haze of all that drifting, hunger, and wandering, you notice something steady beginning to take shape in Gabriel's life. It is not a story this time, nor a fragment of memory. It is a person. You watch as he returns to Barranquilla and reconnects with a young woman he has known since his earliest days. Her name is Mercedes Barca, and she carries herself with quiet calm, a kind of unshakable patience. You can almost hear the gentle laughter in her voice, soft and sure, a sound that will one day steady him through storms of doubt. The love story between Gabriel and Mercedes is not dramatic in its beginnings, but it is constant. While other things in his life waver, money, stability, recognition, she remains a grounding presence. You see him, full of big dreams but empty pockets, daring to promise her marriage even though he has no clear way to support a family. Strangely enough, she believes him, and she waits. Years pass, and she continues waiting, confident that one day his words will become enough to build a life together. A quirky little detail from their courtship is how she agreed early on that he could pay for their wedding rings later. Most people would have laughed, or doubted, but she simply nodded, as if she already knew he was destined for more than his current struggles suggested. You sense that this trust is not blind. It is rooted in her deep understanding of who he is, even before the rest of the world understands. Meanwhile, Gabriel continues moving through life as a journalist and an aspiring novelist, but now with Mercedes in the background of his thoughts. Letters travel between them, carried slowly across distances. In his notes, you see him writing about stories and characters, but tucked between the lines there is always her name. She is not just his sweetheart. She becomes the promise of stability in a life that has always felt unstable. Historians still argue whether Gabriel could have achieved his literary heights without Mercedes. Some believe he would have managed, that his genius was inevitable. Others say her steady presence was the very foundation he needed, that without her patience and unwavering support, he might have faltered in the hard years. You sense the truth leans toward the latter. Genius may write the words, but love gives a space for those words to breathe. The two marry in 1958, a simple ceremony but filled with warmth. You stand with them in the modest church where friends and relatives gather, watching as Gabriel and Mercedes exchange vows. She smiles with calm certainty, while he looks both proud and nervous, knowing his path is still far from secure. Their union is not marked by wealth or prestige but by a quiet resilience, a shared understanding that they will face the future together, whatever it holds. Soon they begin their life as a family. Children come. Rodrigo and Gonzalo, and the house fills with new sounds. Laughter, footsteps, the clatter of small toys. Gabriel, who once roamed through endless boarding rooms in empty apartments, now has a home anchored by Mercedes. Even when money is tight, and it often is, she manages the household with remarkable grace. There are times when debt collectors arrive, times when food is scarce, yet she never panics. Instead, she reassures him, telling him to keep writing, keep pushing forward. One famous moment illustrates her strength. While Gabriel was working on what would become his great masterpiece, 100 Years of Solitude, the family had so little money that Mercedes began selling household items to pay for postage. Each chapter he finished had to be mailed to the publisher in Buenos Aires, but postage was expensive. Piece by piece, she let go of belongings until at last the manuscript reached its destination. Without her persistence, the novel might never have left his desk. This small domestic scene, Mercedes standing in line at the post office, clutching a thick envelope filled with magical sentences, is as important as any battle or political event. Here, love becomes practical, almost heroic. You realize that while the world celebrates Gabriel's brilliance, it is Mercedes who kept the flame burning when the wind nearly blew it out. There is tenderness in their daily life as well. In the evenings, he tells her fragments of stories, and she listens, sometimes laughing at his wild ideas, sometimes nodding in quiet agreement. Their conversations are not grand, but they are intimate, the kind that knit two lives together tightly. You feel how much she enjoys his humor, his sharp observations, and how much he relies on her calm presence. And yet, his devotion to writing often consumes him, pulling him away from everything else. He disappears into his notebooks, into his thoughts, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Mercedes does not protest. She understands that this is part of who he is. Instead, she adapts, creating space for him to vanish into his imagination and return again. Over time, their love proves itself not only in moments of joy but in endurance. They endure poverty, rejection from publishers, and the skepticism of those who doubt Gabriel will ever produce more than scattered short stories. But Mercedes never doubts. Even when others shake their heads, she believes that faith becomes as crucial to his journey as the words he writes. Looking back at these years, you see not a fiery romance filled with drama, but a love rooted in constancy. It is the kind of devotion that grows quietly, like roots deep beneath the soil, unseen but holding everything in place. Without it, the great tree of Gabriel García Márquez's work might have toppled before it could bear fruit. And so, as you drift through this part of his life, you hear not just the clatter of typewriters and the scratching of pens, but also the softer sounds of home. Mercedes humming as she prepares a meal, the laughter of children in the next room, and Gabriel's sigh as he returns to his desk, knowing he is not alone in this journey. The night air feels heavier, yet in your mind there is a brightness, as though a village is taking shape out of nothing but memory and longing. You sit at the desk with him in Mexico City, the scent of coffee gone cold nearby, the sound of typewriter keys striking like rain on a roof. His children are sleeping in the next room, and Mercedes is doing the accounts, calculating how they will stretch the little money left. And there you are, watching as line by line he calls into being a town that will soon be known everywhere. Macondo it begins, not with grand declarations, but with a memory, a story told long ago about his grandfather taking him to see ice for the first time. That ordinary wonder becomes the seed of an extraordinary world. The village grows with each paragraph. Characters arrive with names that seem timeless, like the Bundias, whose generations will live, love, suffer, and circle back upon themselves. You notice how the story carries the smell of mangoes, the sweat of soldiers, the laughter of children chasing after yellow butterflies. The magical and the mundane lie side by side, and you realize that for him this is not invention so much as a reflection of how life itself feels in the Caribbean, where heat blurs reality and imagination into one. Historians still argue whether magical realism was truly born with this book or whether it had lived before in whispers of other writers. But there is no debate about how this work changed everything. Readers in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, picked up the book and found themselves carried away into Macondo, though they had never set foot in Colombia. They read of a woman ascending into the sky while hanging sheets out to dry, of insomnia plagues that erase memory, of wars that drag on for decades with no conclusion, and somehow, all of it felt truer than the neat histories taught in school. A small anecdote floats in, one you cannot forget. During the 18 months he spent writing the book, the family pawned nearly everything they owned. At one point, Mercedes sold the hairdryer and the blender just to buy more paper and ribbons for the typewriter. When he finally carried the manuscript to the post office, it was so heavy that he and Mercedes could not afford the postage. They sent half the chapters first, then returned home to pawn the last household items in order to send the rest. You can almost hear them laughing nervously as they hand the final bundle across the counter, never guessing it would change their lives forever. You stay in the dim room as the last words are typed, the last full stop struck. The manuscript lies there, still smelling faintly of ink and sweat. It is no longer just a story but a world. A world where the Bundias endure through solitude and passion, where time moves in spirals, and where the line between the ordinary and the marvelous disappears completely. When the book is published, it is as though Macondo itself leaps out and takes residence in the minds of countless readers. Critics call it a masterpiece. Friends tell him it is unlike anything ever written. His name, once just a small signature in newspapers, now rings with recognition across oceans, and you, sitting quietly, realize you have witnessed the birth of a legend. You think back to the papery air of his childhood in Aracataca, to the endless tales of ghosts and generals, to the hunger and wandering, and now you see how all of it poured into Macondo. The town is not imaginary. It is a mirror held up to the life he has lived and the stories he has carried, and now it belongs to the world. You step into a hazy cafe in Barcelona, smoke curling upward in lazy ribbons, voices tumbling in Spanish, Catalan, French. He is here, hunched over a table with other writers, listening, laughing, always with that quiet spark in his eyes. The air carries a sense of something shifting, as though success has arrived but is still learning how to wear its own clothes. You can almost hear the scrape of chairs as friends pull closer to him, wanting to be near the man who created Macondo. First though, fame comes slowly. 100 years of solitude spreads like fire in dry grass, but not instantly. Early reviews circle around it cautiously, while others dive in with praise so warm it makes him blush. You imagine him opening letters from strangers across the ocean, readers who feel as though they have found their own lives reflected in the fates of the Bundias. There is joy in those words, but also bewilderment. He had written the book for his country, for his people, and suddenly the entire world is claiming Macondo as their own. Historians still argue whether his fame owed more to the unique timing of Latin American literature breaking into the global stage, or whether it was simply the sheer force of his storytelling. The truth, you sense, is somewhere between. This was the right story at the right moment, written by a man who had been quietly preparing for it all his life. A curious tidbit lingers in your mind. In Mexico, the first print run of the novel was only 8,000 copies. Within 2 weeks they were gone, and printers scrambled to release more. Soon the book was translated into languages he had never even heard spoken before. You picture him marveling at a letter written in Japanese, struggling to understand how someone so far away could fall in love with a village that, to him, smelled of guava and dust. But success does not come without shadows. Fame can be as heavy as it is bright. You watch him walk down streets where strangers now point him out, whispering, sometimes stopping to ask for signatures. He remains humble, even shy, preferring to slip into kitchens with old friends, share laughter and rum, rather than sit on pedestals. Yet he knows he has crossed into another kind of life, one where privacy grows scarce. Still, there are delights. You see him traveling more, speaking in salons, visiting Paris, Havana, New York. His friendships with poets, painters, and musicians deepen. The conversations stretch long into the night, filled with debates about politics, art, the role of stories in shaping nations. And through it all, he holds close to Mercedes, whose calm presence steadies him, whose quiet strength keeps the household running no matter how far he flies. There is another detail that glimmers softly in this period: the yellow flowers. After the novel became a phenomenon, fans began to send him marigolds and paper butterflies, tributes to the enchanted imagery that filled his pages. You imagine them arriving at his doorstep, boxes filled with petals, letters scented with perfume, as though the world itself wanted to join him inside Even so, he remains practical. He sits at his desk each day, writing, revising, never letting the glow of recognition distract him for long. You watch him begin new stories, shorter pieces, experiments in style. He treats the success of his masterpiece not as a crown but as a door. Beyond it, there are more tales waiting to be told, and he knows he must keep walking forward. As you leave the cafe with him, the night air cooler, now you sense the balance he is learning to strike between the ordinary man who once pawned his possessions to finish a manuscript and the celebrated author whose words now shape imaginations across continents. And you realize that fame, while slow to arrive, has settled into his life like a companion, sometimes comforting, sometimes burdensome, but always present. You drift beside him as he packs a suitcase, not for leisure but for necessity. The world that once embraced him with flowers and applause now grows complicated. Governments whisper his name with suspicion, leaders keep their distance, and suddenly the man who created Macondo finds himself living between countries, carrying his stories in exile. The walls of his home seem temporary, the view from each new window a reminder that belonging is sometimes fragile. You remember how deeply politics had always threaded through his life. As a young journalist he covered strikes, uprisings, the uneven weight of power across Latin America. Now with fame amplifying his voice, he cannot remain silent. He speaks out against military regimes, against oppression, against the silencing of writers and the vanishing of citizens. His words are both admired and feared, and you can sense the cost of them. Historians still argue whether his political stances helped or hindered his literary standing, but there is no debate that he carried his convictions like a flame, refusing to let it dim. In Mexico, he finds one kind of refuge, surrounded by fellow writers and artists who, like him, are building a community away from their homelands. In Spain, he shares long nights of discussion, glasses clinking, arguments about the future of literature and the responsibility of artists. And in Cuba, you see him walking alongside Fidel Castro, an unusual friendship that puzzles many. Some say they bonded over books, others over the shared dream of a Latin America with its own voice. That friendship sparks debates that continue even today. Was it political naivety, personal loyalty, or simply a reflection of his deep belief in listening to leaders? No matter how controversial, one small but telling anecdote stands out. On one occasion, at a border crossing, his passport was marked with suspicion, and he was told he could not enter the United States. It was years before he was granted a visa again. Imagine the frustration of a man whose words traveled freely across the world while he himself was denied passage. He often joked about it with a wry smile, but behind the humor there was real pain. And yet, even as governments closed doors, readers everywhere kept opening his books. New works appeared: The Autumn of the Patriarch, Chronicle of a Death Foretold. Each carried traces of exile and displacement, stories of power, solitude, in the ways communities remember and misremember. You walk with him through those stories, noticing how he bends time and memory, how he circles back to themes of decay and resilience, always with that same magical touch. Despite the political turbulence, he remains devoted to the small rituals of daily life: a morning coffee, a midday nap, evenings with Mercedes and the children. He makes jokes, tells long stories at dinner, and fills the house with laughter. Fame and exile may surround him, but he insists on being ordinary, grounding himself in love and family. Still, you sense the weight of solitude returning, though this time not as the imaginative solitude of Macondo, but as the physical loneliness of borders, of friendships divided by ideology, of homes left behind. He belongs everywhere and nowhere at once. And you, standing beside him as he gazes out of yet another unfamiliar window, realize that exile is not only about geography. It is about the ache of being both celebrated and doubted, welcomed and shut out, loved and misunderstood. As the years pass, he learns to live with the contradictions. He continues to write, to travel, to meet with leaders, poets, and revolutionaries. He never stops telling stories, never stops believing in the power of imagination to outlast the walls built by politics. And through it all, you remain near, watching him transform exile into yet another story, one that will eventually return him to the spotlight in a golden hall filled with light. The night sky stretches above Stockholm, gold reflecting faintly off distant windows. You are there with him as he receives the call that he has been awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. The room feels suddenly smaller, the weight of years collapsing into a single moment. He listens quietly, trying to let it sink in, knowing that recognition of this scale is something he never imagined while pawning his possessions in Mexico or scribbling stories in the margins of newspapers. You sit beside him as he prepares for the journey, watching him fold his best suit with care. Mercedes helps him pack, her hands moving with the same quiet precision that has always steadied him. The children peek from behind doors, excited and curious, while he keeps a calm exterior, though inside his heart is racing. This is not just a prize. It is validation, a signal that the long years of wandering, of struggle, of dreaming, have led to a moment that will forever mark the world of literature. The ceremony itself is dazzling. You watch him approach the stage under the golden lights, the weight of history surrounding every step. When he speaks, his voice is measured and calm, but every word carries decades of observation, empathy, and imagination. He thanks the literary traditions of Latin America, the family who supported him, and the unseen ghosts of memory that shaped him from Aracataca onward. Listeners in the hall are moved, some to tears, others to quiet reflection. You can almost hear the murmur of Macondo in his speech, that subtle reminder that magical realism has arrived. That storytelling is not just entertainment, but a way of holding history, culture, and life itself. Historians still argue whether the Nobel Prize was awarded more for 100 Years of Solitude or for the sum of his life. Best work, but as you sit with him, you know it is both. It is the triumph of imagination fused with lived experience, of a man who never abandoned his roots, his family, or the insistence that stories matter. One little-known detail is that before receiving the award, he meticulously rehearsed a short speech on a typewriter in his hotel room. He even timed his pauses, knowing that every word would carry weight. Later, he joked about being more nervous typing it than speaking it in front of the Swedish Academy. You can almost see him smiling quietly, imagining the audience leaning in, expecting genius, while he simply wants to convey gratitude and memory. After the ceremony, there is a quiet moment in his hotel room. The city hums outside, lights flickering through the curtains. You notice how he gazes at the medal, turning it over in his hands, remembering the boy in Aracataca who once stared wide-eyed at the world, hungry for stories. He whispers something to Mercedes, a private reflection that no one else will hear. And you sense the depth of gratitude, the wonder that a life once so uncertain could arrive at this brilliance. Even amid all the celebrations, he remains grounded. He thinks of his parents, long gone, of his grandparents whose tales shaped the architecture of his imagination, of the friends who endured alongside him in years of wandering and exile. And as you sit with him, you notice how this recognition does not inflate him but rather folds him into a broader story. The story of literature itself, where every hardship, every quiet observation, every burst of imagination contributes to the enduring legacy of a single life. And so you leave the hall with him, stepping into Stockholm's crisp night air, feeling the wind as it mixes with the soft glow of a world that has finally noticed the boy from Aracataca, now a man whose stories will live as long as time itself. You follow him into the later years of his life, when the frenetic pace of youth has softened into something calmer, yet no less rich. He spends long mornings writing in his study, sunlight spilling across stacks of paper, ink pens resting on notebooks like loyal companions. His hair has thinned, his face carries the quiet traces of decades spent observing, imagining, and surviving. Yet his eyes still sparkle with curiosity, still light up when a new idea for a story begins to form in his mind. Family surrounds him more fully now. Mercedes remains the steady center, the quiet presence who has been beside him through hunger, exile, and fame. The children have grown, and grandchildren entered the rooms with laughter and curiosity, bridging generations in the same way that he once bridged the ordinary and the magical in his novels. You sense how much he treasures these moments, the small domestic rituals, the gentle arguments over dinner, the reading aloud of letters and stories. Life has slowed, but richness has multiplied. Even as he ages, the world continues to demand his attention. Interviews, lectures, invitations from literary festivals, and awards fill his calendar, but he navigates them with the same calm patience that Mercedes taught him long ago. At times, he reflects on the paths he has taken, the dusty streets of Aracataca, the crowded buses, the cramped apartments, the early struggles of journalism, and marvels at how they converged into a life both ordinary and extraordinary. Historians still argue whether his later works reached the heights of 100 Years of Solitude, but you can see that his focus now is not on accolades but on the enduring power of stories, on capturing the fleeting magic of human experience. A small quirky detail softens the portrait. He continues to write by hand even in an age of computers, often scribbling on scraps of paper napkins and envelopes, as if the act of putting pen to paper is inseparable from the act of imagining itself. Sometimes he misplaces a page and smiles, convinced that it has gone to inspire someone else. There is humor and humility in these small gestures, a reminder that even a literary giant can remain playful and human. Travel still punctuates his years, though now with less urgency. He returns to Colombia periodically, visiting Macondo-like towns, reconnecting with old friends, and observing life as it continues its strange, cyclical rhythms. The same magic that colored his childhood lingers: children chasing butterflies, neighbors whispering stories, rain that seems to last for months, and the ordinary blending seamlessly with the extraordinary. You see him take notes once again, proving that even at the height of achievement, a writer's curiosity never diminishes. He becomes a mentor to young writers, always generous with advice, yet careful not to impose. You sense the way he encourages others to notice details, to embrace imagination, to take courage in telling stories no matter how impossible they may seem. And through it all he remains quietly present in the world he helped transform, aware that literature is a conversation spanning time, memory, and generations. As his health begins to wane, there is a gentleness in his days. Mornings stretch slowly, afternoons are filled with reflection and light conversation, and evenings are dedicated to family and memory. You see him holding Mercedes' hand, exchanging a look that speaks volumes, a bond forged over decades of shared struggle, love, and imagination. The man who once wandered far from home has returned fully, at last, to the quiet center of a life well lived. He passes away in 2014, leaving behind not only novels but the echoes of countless lives touched by his words. And as you stand beside him in these final moments, you realize that he has become both timeless and intimate, larger than life yet deeply human, a bridge between the everyday and the miraculous. You feel the gentle pull of his legacy, as though every reader who has ever held his books carries a piece of Macondo in their own hearts. You let your mind drift slowly now, breathing softly as the story begins to settle like dust falling through sunlight. The life you have followed, from the dusty streets of Aracataca, through the uncertain years of wandering and hunger, to the dazzling brilliance of fame and recognition, feels complete, yet gentle, like a sigh at the close of day. You remember the boy who listened to his grandparents' stories, the young man who roamed newsrooms in cities, the husband and father who built a life of love and quiet resilience. Each stage of his journey seems connected, each moment a thread in a tapestry that stretches across decades, countries, and imaginations. Now, you sense the calm that comes after a lifetime of creation, the noise of typewriters, the buzz of applause, the whispers of governments, all fade into a soft hum, leaving only the resonance of stories themselves. You imagine him sitting in a sunlit room, pen resting gently in hand, eyes half closed, listening to the ordinary world around him, birds, wind through leaves, laughter of family, while the extraordinary hums quietly beneath the surface. And you realize that this life, lived with curiosity, courage, and devotion, has left a gift for everyone who will ever read his words. Macondo lives not only on the page but in the hearts of readers, in the delicate boundary between reality and imagination, the rain that lasts for years, the yellow butterflies, the ghosts of memory. All of it becomes part of a shared universe, reminding us how close the marvelous can be to the everyday. As your eyes grow heavy, you feel the soft pull of night wrapping around you, and the life of Gabriel García Márquez seems to fold into your own thoughts, serene and enduring. Let yourself linger there, breathing in the quiet of stories well told, of a world made richer by wonder, love, and relentless imagination. Soon, the edges blur, and all that remains is a gentle warmth, a whisper of the life lived, a sense that stories, like stars, continue to shine long after their tellers have moved on. And in that quiet, you drift softly, knowing you have walked beside a man whose words will continue to hold you, night after night.